It's not quite 5 in the morning. The sun hasn't come up yet, and the ground is already warm, like a griddle somebody pulled the flatbread off an hour ago. You're walking down a narrow street in Deir el-Medina, somewhere around 1200 BCE. And in the dark, this is the only sane time to make the walk to work. The air is so dry it scratches the back of your throat before you've even started sweating. In 2 hours, the stone you'll be cutting inside the pharaoh's tomb will be hot enough that you don't want to touch it barehanded. In 6, the air in the valley will get thick enough to chew, and the temperature will clear 116 degrees Fahrenheit, 47 Celsius, if you're the one American who thinks in metric. That's not a freak event. That's a Tuesday. For reference, that's about 10 degrees hotter than the inside of a car you left parked in the sun with the windows up, except nobody's opening the door for you in an hour, and your entire workday hasn't even started yet. And here's the strange part. You're not the only one dealing with this heat today. The pharaoh deals with it too, 6 days' travel from here in his palace. So does the vizier, who'll spend noon handling state business in a thick-walled room with a servant fanning him with ostrich feathers. So does the priest, who this very morning will be washing a god statue in cold Nile water. So does the woman at the grinding stones on the next street over, who's got several hours of milling grain ahead of her, out in the courtyard, in full sun. The difference is that the heat you're about to deal with, and the heat each of them deals with, are, functionally, 2 different phenomena, even though a thermometer, if they'd had one, would have read the exact same number. That's what today's video is about. Not how the Egyptians beat the desert. Spoiler, nobody beat it. They just learned to live with it differently depending on what you were born into. We're going through the architecture, the clothing, the drinks, the schedule, and the medicine. And by the end, you'll understand why the exact same afternoon in ancient Egypt could be a minor inconvenience for one person and a fatal threat for another, and why that's still exactly how it works in your own city. Let's get into it. Worth explaining up front why Egypt specifically, and not some other hot patch of the planet, makes such a good case study. It's not just the temperature. You get comparable heat in much more humid places, and it's actually worse there because high humidity stops sweat from evaporating and doing its actual cooling job. The Egyptian desert, by contrast, is dry to an extreme. Humidity there can drop into the single digits. The sky is almost never overcast, and that dryness is exactly what turns the heat from an unbeatable enemy into a predictable, almost solvable engineering problem. Dry air means sweat actually evaporates and cools you. It means the clay jar in the malqaf actually works instead of just getting damp. And it means that at night, with no cloud cover acting as a blanket, heat radiates straight off the ground and walls into a black sky instead of getting trapped the way it does in the tropics. The Egyptians weren't fighting heat in the abstract. They were working with this specific, dry, predictable version of it as raw material. First thing we need to take off the table: the idea that ancient Egyptians were some genetically tougher breed of human, hardwired for heat in a way we never could be. That's a comfortable myth, and people still use a version of it today to excuse leaving folks in scorching cities with no protection at all. The locals are used to it. They're not, and it's a genuinely harmful myth because it robs the Egyptians of the actual credit they're owed. A human body 3,200 years ago worked exactly like yours does right now. Same threshold where overheating starts breaking you down, same dependence on water and salt, same brain that's one of the first organs to check out under dehydration, and it checks out quietly without you noticing. No superpower involved. Just a system built so thoroughly into daily life that it was easy to miss entirely, which is exactly what happened to most people who picture Egypt today and see nothing but pyramids. The Egyptians themselves, obviously, had no idea sweat glands existed. Their medical model of the body was built around the heart and a network of channels called metu, through which everything was believed to circulate. Blood, air, tears, urine, semen. Heat, by that logic, was an excess of something backed up in the channels, and the job was to drain it out or stop it from building up in the first place. And yet their physicians were perfectly capable of reading the symptoms in order, even with zero grasp of the actual cause. First, the person stops sweating and complains of weakness. Then their speech gets muddled and they can't concentrate. Then they stop understanding what's happening to them at all. And at that stage, according to the text, you didn't argue with the patient. You got them into shade immediately, fanned them, and got fluids into them. It sounds primitive, but the practical conclusions drawn from a completely wrong theory turned out to be suspiciously solid. Drink more, sweat it out, don't let the body sit stagnant. You can be off by 3,000 years on the mechanism and still land the right prescription by accident. That's basically how science worked for most of human history. The "this helps" will figure out why later, if ever method. Layer 1. A house that works for you even when you're not in it. An ordinary Egyptian house, not a palace, an actual craftsman's or farmer's house, was built out of mud brick, Nile silt, chopped straw, a mold, and the sun instead of a kiln. Cheap material available to anyone, and precisely because of that, brilliant. A thick mud brick wall doesn't block heat, it stalls it. The daytime heat crawls through 3 feet of packed mud for roughly as many hours as the day itself lasts, and it finally reaches the inside surface of the wall well after dark, right when it's actually gotten cold outside and that leftover warmth is suddenly welcome. Nighttime cold does the exact same lagged crawl and shows up around noon the next day. Nobody designed that wall with a thermal conductivity formula. Generation after generation just noticed that a thicker wall made for a better house, and built thicker. 3,000 years of trial and error beat any theory. Then come the details that stack into a system. Windows were small and set high because hot air rises and you want the exit up top, not the intake down low. Walls were whitewashed because lime reflects solar radiation instead of soaking it in. Streets in villages like Deir el-Medina were narrow enough that neighboring houses shaded each other for most of the day, which saved residents something a modern developer would call passive solar shading, and which back then just got filed under "that's how it's always been." In more spacious settlements, like the workers' town at Akhetaten, houses were built around a small central courtyard, which gave you a shaded spot to cook and work that direct sun barely touched, and doorways were deliberately offset from the prevailing wind, so the house didn't pull in a lungful of hot dust along with the breeze. And finally, the roof. Flat, accessible, and functionally a second bedroom. That's where a family slept for most of the hot season, not in the stuffy room below, because the air actually moves up there and the heat radiates off into a clear night sky with nothing to hold it in. Sleeping on the roof during peak Egyptian summer isn't poverty. It's the one sensible option available to literally everybody. And it wasn't just cooler up there, it was also the one part of the day when you could call over to a neighbor 2 houses down, hear somebody else's kids laughing somewhere nearby, and see the stars clearly enough that it looked like you could set a clock by them, which, as we'll get to, the Egyptians more or less did. The hot season, in that sense, weirdly brought people closer together. The exact same heat that spent all day trying to kill you would herd entire neighborhoods onto their roofs by nightfall. And the evening cool turned into a kind of unofficial block party nobody had bothered to declare a holiday. And that right there is the first crack in the idea that the heat hit everyone equally. Layer 2. Air delivered to your door. On the roofs of some New Kingdom houses stood a structure called a malqaf, somewhere between an exhaust vent and a sail. We know what these looked like because they show up painted on tomb walls, most notably in the tomb of Nebamun at Thebes, around the 14th century BCE, where you can clearly make out a scoop on the roof angled straight into the prevailing north wind. Wind hits the scoop, drops down the shaft, and comes out inside the living space. Meanwhile, the hot air, being hot, is rising and slipping out through those same high windows on the far side. No motor, no power source of any kind beyond wind that blows regardless, and heat that rises regardless. 2 things you can count on more or less forever. Now here's the upgraded version, for anyone who could afford it. A porous clay water jar set inside the malqaf shaft itself. Water seeps through the clay walls and evaporates off the surface, and evaporation carries heat away with it. The air reaching the room isn't just moving anymore, it's been cooled. That's an evaporative cooler, functionally the same principle as the wet pad fan your local hardware store sells for pocket change today. They just built theirs out of a clay pot and a hole in the roof. And this is where the first real line gets drawn between a rich house and a poor one. A malqaf isn't free. It needs a roof of a certain height, a well-fired jar, and the time of a builder skilled enough to put the whole thing together. A farmer out in the Delta, whose hut sometimes didn't even qualify as a proper mud brick house, never had one and never could. He cooled off the same way his goat did, shade and patience. Same heat, same afternoon, but one person gets a personal air conditioner built into the architecture, and the other gets to hope the wind picks up a little more than usual. And here's the detail that genuinely gets to me. This technology didn't die with the pharaohs, and it didn't stay locked in a museum case. In the 1940s, the Egyptian architect Hassan Fathi built a new village called New Gourna for poor farming families near Luxor, a couple of miles from the very tombs those families' ancestors had painted. He deliberately rejected imported concrete, which by then was considered modern, and went back to mudbrick, thick walls, and malqaf-style vent shafts, because it was flatly cheaper and, it turned out, more effective in that climate than anything shipped in. Wealthy neighborhoods in Cairo were already building in concrete and glass and cooling themselves with electricity. The poor got their own ancestors' technology handed back to them because it's the air conditioner for anyone who can't pay the electric bill. Layer 3. What you wear on your body and what you can't afford to wear. Your instinct in extreme heat is to strip down. The Egyptians were smarter than that. They didn't take clothes off, they put the right clothes on. Nearly everything worn in Egypt was linen, and linen happens to be close to the perfect fabric for this climate. The fiber is hollow and breathable. It wicks moisture off your skin and spreads it across the surface where it can actually evaporate, and it doesn't trap heat the way wool does or cling to your skin the way cotton does once things get humid. Loose, light fabric over bare skin also blocks direct solar radiation better than no fabric at all. You lose a bit of airflow, but you gain far more in shade. Being naked under a desert sun isn't freedom, it's just a faster sunburn. But linen came in grades, and that's where the line reappears. There was royal linen, woven so fine that surviving scraps in museums today are nearly see-through, and a weaver could spend weeks producing just a couple of yards of it. The nobility wore that. There was coarse, heavy cloth for the field hand and the stonecutter, and in peak heat, plenty of laborers just went with the bare minimum of clothing, not as a style choice, but because a second set of fine, breathable linen wasn't something their household had the money or the spare weaving hours to produce. Same story with hair. Wealthier Egyptians shaved their heads and wore wigs, partly fashion, partly lice prevention, but there's a practical angle too. A wig sits with a small gap above the scalp, creating a ventilated layer, and you can take it off, wash it, and set it aside whenever you want. Your actual hair doesn't offer you that option. A good wig, though, was labor-intensive. Human hair braided strand by strand onto a woven base, and the elaborate, layered styles favored by nobility could take a specialist weeks to finish, which meant not everyone got one. An ordinary worker cropped his hair short and dealt with it. And of course, the oils and salves used against dry, cracking skin in that superheated air cost money too, which meant they weren't evenly distributed either. Even the famous black eyeliner worn across every social class, according to residue analysis from cosmetic containers at the Louvre, was made from recipes containing deliberately synthesized lead compounds rather than just ground-up natural ones, meaning somebody was intentionally engineering a formula that may have cut the risk of eye infections, which were in ample supply in a country full of standing water and flies. Simple beauty, on closer look, turns out to be one more layer of bodily protection, just paid for in advance. And since I brought up that woman at the grinding stones earlier, it's worth saying that for women, the heat often doubled up. Grinding grain into flour was usually done out in the courtyard, in full sun, because doing it indoors in a cramped room just meant choking on the dust instead. Baking bread and brewing that same beer both required an open fire. So a woman responsible for feeding her family spent her day bouncing between a scorching courtyard and a fire indoors, while the men, at least for part of the day, were out working in conditions that were moving and catching a breeze. A thick wall and a malqaf on the roof don't help you much if the job itself requires standing next to a fire during the hottest hours of the day. Layer 4. What's in your cup depends entirely on whose cup it is. Drinking straight from the Nile was a bad idea. The river carried silt, upstream waste, and parasites like schistosomiasis, traces of which show up even in mummies. So the country's default drink became beer. Thick, low alcohol, brewed from barley or emmer wheat, closer in texture to a runny porridge than to anything you'd picture when you hear the word beer. It was food, hydration, and a paycheck all in one. In Deir el-Medina, a settlement we know more about than almost anywhere else in the ancient world because the residents wrote absolutely everything down on broken limestone, an ordinary laborer was entitled to several jugs of beer a day. Historians estimate roughly a gallon for an adult man. The guy was literally drinking his heatstroke insurance without knowing the term existed. So what did the guy giving the order to quarry that same tombstone drink? The same grain beer, just a better grade, sweetened with dates or honey, sometimes strained multiple times for smoothness, frequently listed in offering texts as its own, more prestigious category, plus wine, either imported or from the nobility's private vineyards, often chilled in cellars or in porous jars set in the draft of that same malqaf. Elite gardens came with ponds, kept up by gardeners specifically for the cool they gave off in the evening. Same Nile, same afternoon, but one man is counting jugs of plain beer because that count determines whether he makes it to sundown, and the other is discussing the bouquet of his wine at the edge of a decorative pond. Layer 5, time itself, structured so the heat never catches you off guard. The Egyptian workday started before dawn and mostly wrapped up by noon. The most dangerous window of the day got shade, food, and sleep instead of labor, and business picked back up as the sun started dropping. We know this in detail specifically because of the Deir el Medina crew again. They worked a shift schedule, 8 days on with 2 days off, and during the working stretch they didn't commute home. They lived in temporary stone huts right up by the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, purely to avoid burning time and energy walking under the sun twice a day. Egyptians even split up the day itself differently than we do. Nighttime hours were tracked by the rising of 36 star groups called deacons, one after another, and that system is where our own habit of dividing the day into equal hours eventually comes from. Back then, though, it wasn't abstract math. It was a practical way to figure out how much longer until the cool of dawn. The Egyptian year also split into 3 seasons instead of 4, and each one was basically a job description. Akhet was the flood, when the fields went underwater and farming was physically impossible. And here's one of the more underrated facts in Egyptian history. A huge share of the labor behind Egypt's big state building projects, pyramids included, happened during exactly these months of forced downtime. Not because farmers were dragged off the fields against their will, but because the state needed to feed and occupy them anyway. You don't leave an entire agricultural workforce idle for 4 months a year without a plan. Festivals, and there were a lot of them on the calendar, also had a habit of landing during the hottest stretches of the year, which for the state was less about piety and more a convenient official excuse to give everyone the day off when working the fields wasn't really an option regardless. The heat didn't just shape what you did in a given day, it shaped what an entire country was doing all year round. Layer 6. What to do when everything above still wasn't enough. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts on the planet, dated to around 1550 BCE, is essentially a first aid kit for when the heat won anyway. Salves for burns made from animal fat and honey, remedies for fever, prescriptions for headache and whole body heat that today we'd immediately chalk up to heat stroke. Some of the recipes are magical incantations, recited while the salve was applied, and that's not a contradiction. It's just what medicine looked like in a world where cause and spell sat side by side on the same page. Beyond the remedies, Egyptians also carried protective amulets meant specifically for the hottest months, believed to ward off the sun god's fiercest, most scorching aspect, which is really just an ancient version of bring water and stay out of the noon sun, dressed up as religious advice instead of medical advice. The practical side of treatment, meanwhile, was laid out with surprising clarity and zero magic involved. Get the person into shade, wrap wet linen around the head and neck, give small sips instead of a full gulp, and lay them down with their feet slightly elevated, almost word for word. What any first aid instructor would tell you today about heat stroke, just without the word electrolytes anywhere in the explanation. Physicians also flagged fever in children and the elderly as more dangerous and requiring immediate attention, an observation you can reach through pure trial and error without understanding for a second why those two groups handle overheating worse than everyone else. And some of it genuinely works. Honey has real antibacterial properties, and a wound treated with it heals better than one that isn't. An Egyptian healer 35 centuries ago couldn't have told you why, but the practice was, once again, well ahead of the theory. Now, the turn I promised you at the start. Stack the house, the air, the clothing, the drink, the schedule, and the medicine together, and what you get isn't one survival system. It's at least 2 running in parallel, and they belong to different people. One person gets thick walls, a malqaf with a jar in it, fine linen, wine from the cellar, and the right to just not go outside if they don't feel like it. The other gets thin hut walls, no malqaf, the bare minimum of clothing not by choice, a cup of plain beer that determines whether he makes it to sundown, and work he has to do regardless, because bread is how he gets paid. Heat in Egypt was not an equalizer. It was, if anything, one of the most honest indicators of inequality nature ever came up with. Because unlike a lot of other threats, you genuinely couldn't hide from it completely. You could only buy yourself more layers of protection between you and it. And here's the uncomfortable part. 3,200 years and one invention of air conditioning later, we haven't solved this problem. We just gave it a new outfit. Public health research shows the same pattern year after year, in city after city. During severe heat, mortality climbs hardest in the neighborhoods where people don't have access to cooling, not necessarily the ones that are objectively hottest. And it's almost always the same groups who go first: elderly people living alone, and anyone who genuinely can't afford the summer power bill, which is to say exactly the people with the fewest layers of protection between themselves and the heat outside today, same as that unnamed farmer 3,000 years ago. Hassan Fathi spent the 20th century trying to fix this through architecture for the poor because he understood that one good technology isn't worth much if only the people who can already afford electricity get to use it. We swapped the thickness of a mudbrick wall for whether or not you own a split-unit AC and the clay jar in the malqaf for a line item on a power bill. But the underlying rule hasn't shifted a single degree. Heat still finds whoever has the least protection first and gets around to everyone else after. So next time you get hot and just flip on the AC or open the fridge, remember, somewhere in Deir el-Medina, a man who had neither still found a way to make it to sundown, not because he was tougher than you, but because every small thing around him, from the thickness of his wall to the jug in his hand, was quietly tuned toward the same goal. He just drew a worse ticket than the viziers 6 days away. You've probably drawn a better one than you realize, and it's worth remembering that occasionally before the AC breaks, not just after. This isn't a guilt trip. It's more a call for clear thinking. The technology to survive heat has existed and worked for a very long time. The only question that's ever mattered is who actually has access to it today and who still doesn't. So here's the question. If the heat in your city suddenly stopped being a matter of comfort and went back to being a matter of survival, how many layers of protection do you actually have between yourself and it? Let me know in the comments. See you in the next one.